Well, thank you very much. So when I'm talking about the offline dimension of online crime, what I mean by this is the actual organization of the cybercriminals themselves. So I'm talking about offenders who know each other in person and who work together in person. And so why I think this is important to discuss is that it's something that's actually happening to a surprising degree. We often think about cybercrime as an online phenomenon in the cybersecurity industry, but those who are investigating the cases themselves will well know that there's actually a substantial amount of this offline factor happening here. And I think it's very, very important to acknowledge this. So I'm going to illustrate this very quickly with an example. So this is the example of Carter Planet. The image you're looking at here is in Odessa, Ukraine. So this is actually the port of Odessa in Ukraine, and right down the end of that pier is a hotel, or a former hotel called the Odessa Hotel. Why this is important is in 2002, a group of cybercriminals under what was known as Carter Planet met at this hotel and held a conference, right? So probably not dissimilar to the sort of conference we're having here. They were talking about what was the state of the field. They were talking about how they could improve the business. All sorts of important questions were under discussion here. And they did this actually more than once. So this was a group that was focused very much on credit card fraud as well as related disciplines. They met, as I mentioned, in 2002. They'd previously met in Odessa in 2001. And I encountered a number of other instances of this where they came together because it's very important for networking, for socializing as well, but to develop the business as much as anything. And this we see throughout many, many examples of cybercrime. And so that's what I'm going to tell you about today. So in terms of the approach that I've taken and the focus that I have in this talk, I think the importance of this offline, it's not just an interesting curiosity. I think it can actually help shape how we think about dealing with cybercrime. So I'm going to talk to you more about this towards the end of the presentation. But what I'm interested in here is that instead of viewing cybercrime solely as a technical phenomenon, as an online phenomenon, if we start looking into this offline aspect, we can also start thinking about what are potential solutions in more human terms, in social and economic terms, that might help us address this issue in a more comprehensive way. As was mentioned in the introduction, what this presentation is based on is a much bigger project, something that took me 7 years of my life. Traveling around the world, I went to Russia, I went to Ukraine, Nigeria, Romania, China, Brazil, US, many other places, to try and really understand on the ground, in human terms, how cybercrime worked and how this functioned as an industry. And so as part of this, I did 238 interviews with people from law enforcement backgrounds, with people from the private sector, and importantly, people who were former cybercriminals themselves, so I could get that perspective. So what this slide shows is really two spectra, and I think these are very important in trying to understand cybercrime, and particularly what I'm talking about in terms of this offline dimension. So on one of the spectra, we have the shift from legitimate to criminal, and on the other one, we have offline to online. And so I think this is going to help us as I go through this presentation in understanding this. So I picked some very, very generic images to help explain this, because I think those usually work quite well at conferences. So these are big buildings, if you can't tell. This is to illustrate what is legitimate, what is traditional business, so to speak. So traditional business throughout human history has been an offline phenomenon, because we didn't actually have the internet for much of human history. So that's what it's always looked like, quite simple. That's what we open with. We then get new technologies, we get the internet, we get new opportunities. Now, this other generic image could represent virtual companies, but actually I don't think it really does, because if we think about how the tech world functions, we do have certain companies that operate almost completely virtually, but for most they don't actually. We're still seeing office space, we're still seeing people meet up at conferences, have meetings. We're seeing still face-to-face, regardless of the fact of new technologies coming in. So we might have that greater opportunity in terms of virtual communication and collaboration, but we're still seeing, and if we think about the largest tech companies, they're rooted very much in office space. They're rooted in physical locations and in working together, regardless of these new opportunities. And so what I'm going to suggest to you is that if we think about the criminal world, and we can look at The Godfather here as a stand-in for traditional crime, we're going to see something quite similar, right? We're not necessarily going to see the shift straight into a purely online environment. We're going to see some sort of some lag, some connection to the offline. So the final and most generic image, if we think about the top right quadrant, this is where we think of cybercrime traditionally. We think about the online, we think about the criminal. This image, I think, is probably on half of the cybersecurity reports about cybercrime out there. I can tell you as someone who's interviewed cybercriminals themselves, I don't think any of them were wearing hoodies when I talked to them, and most of them had faces, which is kind of unusual. But so this is important, because what I'm presenting to you in this talk is that actually these are people and they exist in physical locations, and they often, not in all cases, but in a surprising number of cases, work together with other people in those physical locations. And so what we're seeing when we think about this shift is a shift towards the online, but not necessarily requiring that the offenders are working exclusively online together. So this whole quadrant, these axes, are really representing a blurring. And I think the blurring happens in multiple directions. So I'm focusing very much on the blurring between the offline and the online, and we see this just as much with traditional criminals trying to use technology, but very much these cyber criminals rooted in the offline space to a degree. And I think there's also blurring between legitimate and the criminal in the cybercrime space. What we're seeing in certain locations where cybercrime is a major issue, so if we think about locations like Eastern Europe, there's a little bit of a blurring between what is the legitimate, what is the criminal, and that blurring often takes place in the space around corruption, because the state is allowing criminal activity to become something that is legitimized in some way, but also those involved in legitimate business face challenges in terms of day-to-day operations and certain compromises also related to corruption and other issues as well. So in terms of the research that I did, there were really three types of offline collaboration that occurred throughout the examples that I studied. So the first one was meetings between offenders. So this can happen in different ways. It can be that they originally meet online, but then take it offline. So this would look like, they begin getting to know each other, they speak for a bit of time, they might talk on the phone or through some other method, and then eventually they might choose to meet in person, whether because they're from the same country or someone else is visiting the area. But what I also encountered was people who knew each other in the first instance in the offline space. So they knew each other personally before they started getting involved in cybercrime. So that's something that very much happens. The second one relates to examples like Carter Planet that I talked about, which is cyber criminals coming together, they have meetings, they have gatherings. This is an important component of networking and really pushing business forward. And the final one is operational groupings. So this is moving beyond just markets and trading and working together in a kind of loose collaborative way. These are people, groups of cyber criminals coming together to actually carry out key components of the business. And so they begin to look a lot like companies. They look like firms in some way. And so I've given you a few examples here. And you can see actually from these examples the kind of corporate-like image, the corporate-like structure that they like to appeal to in some of these cases. So the example of Liberty Reserve, and that's the logo of Liberty Reserve, if you don't know the case, it was a very, very important virtual currency. So we're now focused very much on cryptocurrencies, but before the cryptocurrencies became dominant, Liberty Reserve was actually very, very popular amongst the cybercriminal community in terms of allowing them to trade in the online space. But what's interesting about this case was that the company of Liberty Reserve was actually very much an offline company in terms of how it was structured. So they were based out of Costa Rica. They had an office in a business park. In that business park was Hewlett Packard, was Western Union. They had about 50 employees. They look very much like a startup. So really what we're talking about here is a cyber criminal startup. We're talking about something that makes money, that is structured very, very similarly to other startups that you might see in the legitimate sector. But in this case, the customer base was almost entirely criminal. That's what defined this particular example. If we look at some of the other cases, we have Rove Digital there, which was an Estonian company. It had a CEO. It was basically a web hosting company of one kind or another, but they became very, very heavily involved in a DNS changer case where basically they were sending people to locations that they didn't necessarily want to go and weren't particularly good for them. But what happened is this is a company that had a good reputation, that was actually getting good press, but they were effectively a criminal company at the end of the day. And if we look at the bottom two cases, what we're talking about there is banking Trojans. We're talking about the groups who are either behind the coding of these Trojans or the exploitation of them. So the Carburb example that I have there was one group that was exploiting that particular malware. They were arrested and they were operating out of a leased office space. So they had the appearance of a startup. And the final one there, that shiny building, that's a case that's quite murky that we don't know a huge amount about, but that's the Dyer case. And in that case, an arrest happened. A number of arrests supposedly happened in this particular building in Moscow, where they picked up people who then basically led to the disruption of that particular piece of malware. So you can see the kind of very corporate appearance and the offline being very important in how these groups function. But what I want to present to you is that it's not so much just cybercriminal groupings, cybercriminal businesses. These businesses are actually part of a broader economy. So they don't exist in isolation. They come from certain places, they exist in those locations. So this is an image of Râmnicu Vaucea in Romania. Some people might be aware of this case. There was a very famous article written a few years ago in Wired, and basically its nickname is Hackerville. Right? It's probably not the correct nickname because it should be called Fraudville, which is what they focus on in this location is online auction fraud. So this is selling things originally on eBay and other similar platforms that don't exist. It's a very, very simple scam. They sell cars that don't exist, they rent apartments that don't exist. This is how it works. The complication becomes not so much around the scam that they're running, but the organization behind the scam. And so in this particular instance, many of these offenders are known to each other in person. Many of them actually grew up together from the same communities. They might have gone to the same schools, and they really want to work with trusted groups of people. They want to stay within trusted networks. And so that's very, very important in terms of how this works as a broader economy. It's not just individuals who are in groups, it's actually people as part of a much broader network. And the offline is really the dominant in terms of how these types of these groups function. And this is not an isolated example. We see Nigeria is very similar in terms of how these offenders work together, that they come from the same trusted groups, and it's very, very important in terms of who they want to work with and who they want to bring into the group. So what I want to suggest to you is that actually what we're looking at here is a balancing act. So I don't want to leave you with the message that cybercrime is an offline issue and there is no online. That's not the message I want to leave you with. Actually, we still see certain offenders who are very much quite keen to remain online, that they don't want to meet up with in person. So that's still a very, very important part of this. What I'd suggest to you is what we're seeing is both. And we see this sort of balance between the two. And it's very much down to individuals and the type of business that they're involved with as to how much offline exposure they want. And so what we're seeing here is really a tension between what is related to trust and enforcement. So basically in terms of if you know someone physically, you know them personally, you have a history together, you might feel very comfortable working with them. You might feel that there's an opportunity for enforcement if something goes wrong, that you can beat them up, these sorts of things. But the flip side of that is you're giving away your identity. So you're more vulnerable to arrest, you're more vulnerable to investigation. And so there's a balance to be had. And I've encountered people on both sides of this, some who really want to protect their identity at all costs, and others who it's just important to work with people that they know. So what I'd suggest to you is that there's a spectrum of cybercriminal behavior, and this is how it functions. So in terms of the message I want to leave you with, having gone through this analysis of the offline and how this functions, I'm left with the thought that, and it's a bit of a curious thought given this is a presentation on cybercrime, but that perhaps cybercrime doesn't really exist. And what I mean by that is not to be flippant, but to say that what we're looking at here is really cybercrime as part of a broader understanding of crime, and perhaps a broader understanding of business in some sense, because it's not, I don't think, an isolated magical new space that can't be understood. I think there's actually direct connections with our traditional understandings of how criminals work and how people work. And that to me is very, very important in terms of addressing this issue, is that we don't get carried away with all the new, that we still focus on what is the old. And I think this example of the offline is very, very important in terms of placing cybercrime within this broader context of human life. So in terms of some policy and big picture thinking of what does this offline tell us? How does it shape the way that we think about cybercrime? So as I mentioned towards the beginning of the talk, I think it shapes how we think about cybercrime because it moves this discussion from being a purely technical and online type of problem, one where we need to fight it online, we need to fight it in technical terms. I don't want to suggest that we should stop doing that. There's obviously a huge importance in doing that, and there's a very, very important aspect of this is continuing that fight. But I think we also need to be delving further into some of the other options that we have available to us. And what this offline analysis opens up is really dealing in much more human terms and dealing much more in local terms about how to deal with this particular problem. And so I've put up here three potential approaches, and I'm not going to tell you that these are easy approaches. These are big picture, difficult approaches, but I think they certainly warrant further attention in terms of how we could potentially carry them out. So the first one is around local law enforcement. If we're seeing groups of people operating out of specific locations and working together, it would suggest to you that addressing this problem is going to be very much rooted around the local law enforcement response. So what we're going to be thinking about here is how do we improve capacity in not just every location or any location, but in the specific locations where cybercrime is a problem. There's already some programs in place we've seen in Romania and other countries, and I think it's very, very important that we think about supporting these efforts and also measuring the effectiveness of these efforts. The second one is a very, very difficult question, which is corruption. In a lot of these instances, what we're seeing is corruption providing a supportive mechanism for cybercriminals acting locally. If they're going to be having this sort of offline space where they're going to operate, it's much easier to operate out of that space if you have protection, if you have people who are supporting you within the system and basically preventing you from being arrested. So while it's a difficult task, I think we need to think about how can we support broader corruption reduction efforts. The final point, I think, is something that actually everyone in this room can potentially play a role in. So I'm going to leave you with something that's practical in the sense that it is something that each one of you can think about in terms of the day-to-day life as to how you might help with this issue. And that is, it's my belief, having done this 7-year study, that a number of the people involved in the cybercrime industry, and this is particularly the case in places like Eastern Europe, these are very, very highly skilled, intelligent, educated people. And I think in certain cases, had there been a different pathway, they might be quite happy to find themselves out working in legitimate industry. They would be quite happy applying these very similar business practices that they're using to create cybercriminal startups, that they might be quite open to doing a legitimate startup or working in a startup. And so for me, what this looks like in practice is thinking about ways in which we can really enhance the pathway out of cybercrime in the locations where cybercrime is very prevalent. And so one way this could be done is through injecting capital into some of these locations, providing a pool that can be used by entrepreneurs in this area, in these geographical locations, to try and create startups that are legitimate. But even simpler than that is actually thinking about our hiring practices. We think a lot and hear a lot about cybersecurity skill shortages, and what we have in certain parts of the world, like Eastern Europe, is a huge pool of people who are skilled in cybersecurity. And so what I want to suggest to you is we already know there are people working throughout the industry from Russia, from Ukraine, from a whole range of different countries, from Romania, who are doing great work. And I think it's important to think about how we can be expanding these hiring practices, how we can think about including more people from this region within the broader tech sector. Because I think if we provide greater opportunity, what we're going to be doing is really limiting the pool into cybercrime in some of these locations. And at the same time, we're also going to be giving an opportunity to people who I think very much want one, and we're going to be pushing talent away from criminality and into something where I think it can have a positive impact for the broader sector. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.